New York City announced earlier this month that workers who lost their jobs for refusing to comply with vaccine mandates will be cut off from unemployment checks, cash assistance, and food stamps, putting thousands of vulnerable New Yorkers at risk of losing government benefits.
In a piece for the Vulgar Marxism Substack, researcher and writer Matthew Thomas says, quote, "The fact that the state remains unable to promote greater uptake of vaccinations, especially among vulnerable communities, is its own fault, as is the fact that every facet of the pandemic response has become a front in the culture war. Instead of trying to paper over these failures with coercive measures to punish the ignorant poor, New York should try actually fulfilling its obligations to its residents, which include the provision of social services to those in need." Matt Thomas joins us now to expand on his reporting. Welcome to Rising.
Thank you for having me, Ryan.
And so, what are they using? I understand how they could try to find a legal justification for cutting off unemployment, because if you voluntarily leave a job, they can cut you off there. And they would argue, well, you're voluntarily leaving because you had an opportunity to stay by taking the jab. How are they going to expand that to other provisions of social services? We're setting aside the morality or the pragmatism of the policy, but just legally, how are they going to try to claw back food stamps and those types of benefits?
It's somewhat unclear. So the way that social services operate in New York is that programs like food stamps and cash assistance, eligibility for them is set at the state level, and then the programs are implemented at the local level. So the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance is a state agency which sets criteria for eligibility for all these programs, and then also provides guidance as to how they're to be implemented to 57 or 58 local social service departments in New York. There's one for each county, except for New York City, which has one Department of Social Services for the whole city. And so those agencies are implementing this policy, which is typically implement policy which is set by the state. But it's unclear where this originated. So this policy was announced by the Human Resources Administration, which is the entity in New York City, which implements food stamps and cash assistance in the 5 boroughs. I've made inquiries to sources in the mayor's office and close to the governor's office to find out whether, or just to confirm whether it came down from the state level, whether it was just the city sort of freelancing, but it's somewhat unclear. And I've spoken with Linda Rosenthal, who's the chairwoman of the State Assembly's Committee on Social Services, and her office is committed to finding out what the legal basis for the decision is, because they were very interested in that question as well.
So for food stamps, for instance, are there other eligibility requirements like drug testing or something like that's in the ballpark of requiring vaccination?
I don't believe there's any drug testing. There is an income requirement, obviously, which is based on household size. So if you are one single person household, I think it's something like $16,000 a year. You can't make more than that in order to be eligible for food stamps. And then if you have 2 people in your household, then you can earn a little bit more. But there isn't any type of drug testing or anything like that, but it is based on income. So I'm not sure, honestly, because of the difficulty of getting in contact with the agency. I can't tell you how difficult it is to get state agencies to respond to a publication called Vulgar Marxism. But I'm diligently trying, and there, as I said, Assemblywoman Rosenthal has said that she is on this as well. So hopefully we'll be able to learn more about the legal basis for the decision.
Yeah, you're going to need some umbrella brand that you kind of write under for when you reach out to agencies. That's just like New York News or whatever. Yeah, liberal news. Call it that. Then then maybe they'll get back to you. But
misinformation report.
Yes, anti-misinformation
report. Fact checker.
There you go. But Robbie's point about drug testing is an interesting one, because the right for years, their assault on these types of social programs has been to try to chip away at them by insisting that everybody, be of upstanding moral character who gets any benefit from the state. And, that includes all sorts of requirements and hoop jumping. Drug testing is one thing that, they've pushed really hard to try to implement. around the country. In order to get benefits, you gotta test. You have to a lot of work requirements or something that the right loves to put in. And so the left has responded by saying, no, get your judgment out of this. If you're in need, we're gonna, the state is here. As people collectively, we're helping each other. So how do we get to a place where now the left is saying, no, we collectively are going to help people who are in need, but there's an asterisk on this?
It's really unfortunate, and I think it has to do with the politicization of the pandemic response and the fact that on the left, a lot of psychic energy is now invested in their self-image as people that take COVID seriously. I think that the fact that, the right, for whatever reason, like the pandemic response polarized along these political lines that saw the right take up the mantle of lax enforcement of social distancing, sort of COVID denialism, which is certainly unfortunate and has resulted in a tremendous amount of death and suffering. And I think that people correctly, critique that and are put off by it and even shocked by it, especially people that have suffered from COVID or had family members get sick or hospitalized or even die. So on one level, it's very understandable that people react in this way, that they invest a lot of their identity in being somebody that takes COVID seriously, which means robust enforcement of things like social distancing and masking and vaccinations. But it has led to a place where I think it causes people to abandon commitments that they previously had. And it's operative on the right as well. You see 4 states at least have passed legislation that extends unemployment benefits to people who were fired for refusing the vaccine. Now, this is a party which has, spent the entire Trump presidency imposing work requirements for Medicaid and food stamps and other things like that, and was against pandemic unemployment assistance being extended, and yet. It's the same story on both sides.
Unemployment assistance only for people who
That's right.
are unvaccinated.
As I say in the piece, both parties want to be generous with their own constituencies and use the threat of destitution to whip everyone else into shape.
But I think the real threat of something like this is that, look, those who want to have more mandates, more requirements, more enforcement are choosing what are the choke points? What are the areas where we already have some kinds of additional restrictions, like it could be air travel, and then people start saying, well, maybe we have to have a vaccine mandate for air travel. Like, that's a place where you could kind of force it because we're already accustomed to all these infringements on our liberties. And then another one would be like, well, providing assistance to certain people. We put requirements on it, so in some cases, depending on what it is. So yes, we could put more requirements there, and that's how they're going to force through a kind of general, nope, everybody's going to be vaccinated because for one reason or another, even though we can't just mandate that, we're going to find a way to force you because you'll fall into one of these, you'll be entangled in one of these intersections where we can require it.
Yeah, and I think that the way to evaluate that is, what do you think is on the side of the line where something is a right that's inalienable? You can make a case that, nobody really believes in like true libertarianism, or like the state doesn't have a right to regulate public health.
Just me.
Just you. Yes, let me not put words in your mouth. But very few people believe that the state has no capacity or should have no capacity to pursue public health or to regulate industry or things like this. And so it's certainly, most everyone would agree that it's appropriate for certain interventions to be in place to ensure a robust public health response. The question is, where is the line where the state is not permitted to be coercive? So if you believe that everyone has a right to subsistence, that they have a right to not be hungry and to have shelter, then that becomes an area where the state should not withdraw what it provides to its citizens. An area like air travel, without expressing an opinion myself, I think that's an area where almost everybody would agree that that is an area which is not having to do with like a fundamental right in the same way. Like the right to ride a plane is not the same as the right to not be hungry. Now, these are all contested, obviously, because some people would say that there isn't a right to not be hungry or to not be homeless. But from the left, you get a lot of people that say that that is. And so it doesn't really make sense from that perspective to carve out this one area where it is permissible to use the threat of hunger and destitution and homelessness to force compliance with a particular policy.
Have you sensed any movement, any thawing among the liberals on this question as case counts have come down so significantly in New York, where you are, and also around the country generally, and as the politics have seemed to turn? In your circles, are you seeing a shift, or are people kind of clinging to that identity that you talked about earlier?
I think it depends on the intervention. I think most people, I mean, this is purely anecdotal, but in lefty circles, there's still a big investment in mask mandates, especially masks in schools. I think that when, it was announced last week, I believe, that New York was considering ending its masking requirement at the end of the month in schools. They just let the mask mandate elsewhere expire last week. And there wasn't a huge pushback. I think the lack of sort of interest in the subject represents a thawing, although there was some grumbling. Again, this is just like my Twitter feed, so take it for what it's worth. But I think that it will be quite controversial if they do remove the masking mandate in schools because of the level of investment, as I said, in this identity as people that take COVID seriously. With other things like the provision of social services, I think there's actually not a huge realization that some of these policies are in place, or that the state is pursuing some of these strategies. And so, when you pin people down, one thing that I think is interesting is that everybody that I spoke with for the piece agrees that the threat of hunger is a step too far, that they shouldn't take food stamps away from people who were fired for being unvaccinated. But they either ignored the question about unemployment benefits or said that they did not believe that those should be provided. So I think there's a lot of kind of sloppy thinking, or maybe not thinking through a lot of the philosophical basis for some of their opinions.
We have to almost leave it there, but I don't know what the phrase vulgar Marxism means. Is there a short answer you can give me?
I like to say that my analysis and my politics are class first, not class reductionist or only. But I think that, unfortunately, on the left, there is a neglect of class and an overemphasis on a kind of vulgar identitarianism. And so vulgar Marxism is a provocation to try and push things back to the class side of the ledger.
Well, there you go. I learned something new.
Marxism with no nuance, just all class.
Great.
And without actually having read any Marx that's basically, right? That's vulgar Marxism.
Speak for yourself, Ryan. I'm a proud dropout of a PhD program.
Well, what I mean is that's what it implies, that it's just,
No, of course, yeah.
Right, yeah.
Could have guessed. All right, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, guys. Thank you very much.
And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.